Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns. And our political science expert is really a professor at Inver Hills Community College. He's been with us before. Lucky to have him and pleased to have him back, Zack Sullivan.
Thanks for having me, Alan.
And a favorite of his students and most members of the faculty. Well, we have a lot to talk about assessing the 2012 election.
We do.
It was an overwhelming win for Democrats nationally, although the House of Representatives didn't change, and certainly locally. For the first time since the 80s, we have a Democratic House or Assembly or whatever you want to call it, Senate, and the governorship. So we can really expect some things to change this coming 2 years at least.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I think if you, first of all, you start at the national level where you began there. I have heard some rhetoric that, well, this isn't a mandate for the president, this isn't a mandate for Democrats, but the way I read it is it was a decisive victory for the president, both in the Electoral College and in the popular vote. The Democrats picked up 2 seats that most folks thought they were in danger of losing the Senate chamber. They picked up 2 seats there, and it looks like they're going to pick up around 6 seats in the House right now. So to me, that is, while not a landslide victory in the sense that the House dramatically shifted, but it is a clear pickup across the board for Democrats in D.C. and then here at the local level with both houses switching and the Democrats enjoying majorities that were larger than the Republicans they're replacing. It is a clear victory, and then like you mentioned, both elected branches of government in the control of Democratic hands, or DFL hands, for the first time since 1990.
And of course, in this area, I have to go back for a second to George W. Bush, who claimed he had a mandate when he won by a few hundred votes, although they stopped the count. So we really don't know what that true count would have been. He had a mandate, and now I hear the right wing saying that it wasn't such a big victory for Obama, who won by 3 million votes in the popular vote, who carried the Electoral College 3-2, and if that's not a mandate, I don't know what a mandate is.
Yeah, it's interesting, and in the second re-election of President Bush in 2004, he used the language, and it was by margin similar to this. I have amassed political capital, and I intend to spend it. And we haven't heard that rhetoric yet out of the president, but I think if you can make that assertion then, you could probably make that assertion now.
Now locally, for instance, in this area, we took back all 3 seats. Jim Carlson won back the Senate seat, Sandy Mason, and Lori Halverson, who's a newcomer, won in the House. Halverson beating young Wardlow, Doug Wardlow, who brought disfavor on himself not only in his own party, but with the voters as well. And Sandy Mason, who was very popular, beat Diane Anderson, who I don't know has ever done anything without reading it from a script. But be that as it may, they're gone. And we really feel very positively in terms of moving forward. Not necessarily because they're Democrats, but because they're willing to talk and bargain and listen and really negotiate and do things that have to be done. And that seems to have been a lost, I don't know what, trait of the right wing and the Republican Party.
Well, I think it was looking very good, even though you don't have district by district data as you do for Congress, obviously. But when you see so many direct rematches from 2 years ago, and they were squeakers of wins for the Republicans, you had to think there was a pretty good chance of both legislative houses turning, because we know what that looked like. We know that they pulled out majorities in the House by around 700 votes overall, and in the Senate by 2,000 overall in a state that has millions of voters. That they had a good chance of retaking both chambers. The Senate looked easier than the House, but both were decisive in that regard. And then these suburb races here in Eagan, but also in Edina, really trended for the DFL, which gave them the majorities that they needed.
So it should give the governor the opportunity to move forward on some of his programs, infrastructure programs, budgetary considerations, perhaps changing the tax structure a little bit, moving up in the Iron Range and doing some of the things that we have to do, bonding, which got shot down by 1/3 in the last legislature, things that are really important for us, health care as well.
Yeah, he will have no excuse. And I'm not to say that he's making excuses, but when you control both legislative chambers, when your party does, you have a real opportunity for the next 2 years, and to lead a center-left coalition to tackle a very clear agenda. And so hopefully the governor, along with legislative leaders, are putting forward that agenda. And if they do a good job and they are seen as not as making headway on that agenda without the notion of overreach, they can get a lot done in 2 years. They absolutely can. The governor really is in the driver's seat when it comes to public policy in the state. That's been a little different over the last 2 years because we haven't had sort of traditional Minnesota Republicans that were more centrist, as we've seen in the past.
No, we had what the whole country had, which was really the Tea Party advocates, the extreme right wing, the take no prisoners, I will not negotiate philosophy people in there. And obviously, if you look across the country, the citizens rejected that, and rejected it soundly.
It does seem to be the case, and I think it was more soundly rejected here than it was in other states. You know, some states, if you take a look at Indiana, for example, saw Republican gains. So we are seeing sort of a polarization of states. Some states are becoming more Republican, some are becoming, but in this state, it's quite clear that it is a state that has had a centrist Republican Party in the past, and sort of an Arnie Carlson wing of the Republican Party. And it looks like the demand is there for that. Now, the interesting thing is what lesson is learned by the state Republican Party. Do we make the argument, well, we lost because we weren't conservative enough? Or do we make the argument that we need to, again, become a center-right party, stay away from social issues, and focus on that?
Well, their initial reaction was not conciliatory. It really was down the party line, but I wonder if that's going to carry through. And I have the feeling that it's not. I think that there will be some compromise here. I think that there are some rational heads. I think that there's some rational people on both sides that want to move forward for the good of the people. Now, one of the things we haven't talked to, and this was known as the do-nothing legislature, the one that just concluded, was the fact that one of the few things they accomplished was trying to put 2 constitutional amendments in our Constitution. 6 months ago, people would never have guessed that they would go down. In my estimation, 2 things that certainly did not belong in the Constitution: voter ID, particularly the way it was framed, and we have our other one in terms of, what the hell was the second one?
Right, gay marriage.
The gay marriage,
Yeah.
which, first place, there's a law in this state against
Sure.
gay marriage. I hope that law falls in this legislature. Second, the millions of dollars that were spent, and I saw something about $100 million spent by the church, by the Catholic Church, to fight gay marriage, which to me, when we have people starving, when we have people who are homeless, that all that money was spent on an issue like that, you would think that, excuse me, maybe once and for all, it's behind us.
Well, you know, the charge with respect to legalization of gay marriage from opponents of the legalization of gay marriage has been, well, this has been done largely by the courts. This hasn't been done through popular vote of the electorate. And I think what you see in the four decisions that were done across the country, the 4 states that rendered decisions on this, this was a clear example of citizens stepping away from that trend. So opponents to marriage equity, I think, can no longer say that there's a popular mandate for marriage inequality. But they are interesting. I, for one, thought that the marriage amendment probably would not pass, but I was surprised that the voter ID did not pass. And
I think a lot of us were.
and the polling indicated that it would. The reason why we were surprised is the polling indicated that it might carry, but the relatively small amount of state polling that was done for both of them did indicate that attitudes were narrowing and moving in the direction of opposition. I just didn't personally think it would overtake that, because there's a certain kind of pseudo common sense notion about voter ID, which is, oh, how hard is it to take out your ID? But I think when people really dug into the meat of the proposed change to the Constitution, folks started to realize it was less about identification and it was more about a fundamental change to the election system, making it harder for people to participate.
Well, that's what Mary Kiffmeyer did when she was Secretary of State. And, of course, making it harder to participate for people whose leanings were left-leaning. But at the same time, while she was attempting to disenfranchise a lot of those people, and that's what this was all about across the country, funded by ALEC, funded by the Koch brothers, funded by the Karl Rove PAC, etc., was to keep Latinos away from the polls, to keep blacks and impoverished. And in some cases, the military as well were being punished by some of this thrust. What this country should be about is letting every person who is eligible to vote and who wants to vote, vote.
Sure, and you know, I mean, certainly there are times when you take a look at an election system and you may see some sort of endemic fraud in that system that you have to deal with, and that's a very pragmatic approach. But the problem here is there was no evidence of it. And I think the opposition said, well, we don't really know if this is happening. But we really do, because if someone goes in and says, hey, I'm Ellen Miller, I'm here to vote, you know, whatever, and they're not you, they sign your name and they do that. And then when you show up, they say someone came in here and they were impersonating you. That's clear evidence. So this notion that this could really take place.
We had one case of that in 10 years.
It's just
in
not
Minnesota,
happening. And then the
it happened
Kiffmeyer
to be one of Kiffmeyer's employees.
And then the Kiffmeyer response was, well, we have these people who are convicted of crimes or convicts who are on parole that shouldn't be voting yet. And well, first of all, they can have driver's license, so this voter ID thing didn't really address that. But the other thing is when you register, they take a look at a criminal background, they take a look at the National Death Registry. And so I'm glad that the public saw through this, because this wasn't simply a matter of my opinion. This is something that was quite a matter of fact, that folks just aren't getting away in any real numbers with voter fraud in this state. The other thing is, I mean, just look at it logically. Who's going to say, well, I'm going to risk a year in jail for committing a federal crime, vote fraud, so I can get one more vote for my candidate? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense.
It makes no sense at all.
So,
And
yeah, to me that was quite clear, and if you did take a look at some of the debates that were occurring on Minnesota Public Radio and other areas between Kiffmeyer and opposition, not to mention, so the facts there were clear, but not to mention the expense of implementing this program. And David Schultz did an analysis of what that would cost, and it was going to cost millions of dollars to deal with a problem that there was no data existed.
I heard a figure of up to $100 million. I think that's a little bit high, but still. And one of the things that the Kiffmeyer devotees said was that we have a lot of felons voting. The fact of the matter is that people, when they're on probation and parole, can't vote until they're off it.
That's right.
But the probation and parole officers had a duty to tell those people that. There was a big gap there where they weren't told. Well, if they weren't told, and it was 199 people, I think, that they talked about. If they weren't told, they had no way of knowing. They go to the polls, they show, if necessary, a picture. They don't even need that. And that's not voter fraud. That's a vote in ignorance because of misinformation. Very different from maliciously taking names off of gravestones and voting them, as we had around the 1900s.
And this response would have done nothing to deal with that because those folks can drive and they could, they could go get a DMV ID. So the argument that that would deal with this issue is just, inaccurate. But that doesn't mean that there aren't common sense ways if people are concerned about this. You mentioned these broader national interests that were driving this, and I think that's another important aspect. Is this was not sort of this organic grassroots, people are concerned about voter fraud here. This was an external push nationwide to just make it harder for people to vote. And if you take, like you said, if you take a look at unlawful voting, just simply human error, machine error, that's going to account for many more inaccuracies in the overall voting tally than people making an honest mistake like what you're talking about, or the handful of people that willfully commit fraud.
I was much more concerned with the fact that Mitt Romney's son owned a company that had the election machines in 2 states, including Ohio, than I was about people illegally voting.
You do see that, machines, I can't speak to that specifically, but machines make mistakes. Sometimes they make a lot of mistakes. You look at Florida in 2000, some of these machines were kicking out 10% of the ballots, So that is a real issue, and this is one area where Minnesota is a model for the entire country, because what happens is when we do these hand recounts and we look at what the machine said and we look after the hand recounts, they vary by a very, very small number. And we know because we've had recounts recently.
It was a Franken election.
And we've got a good system where the people on that panel are agreeing on the outcome because we really do. So the irony is painting our state as one that needs reform when it comes to voting, when the rest of the country, secretaries of state across the country, are looking to Minnesota and saying, how do you do it? So maybe, hopefully that message started to get out. It did look like it was bad law, and I don't say that as a sort of a matter of partisanship. I really try to look at politics pragmatically, but just in the fact that this was a problem, as Dayton had said, this is a problem, this is an answer seeking a problem.
And I think Mark Ritchie took a tremendous amount of unwarranted abuse when he really, really ran a tight ship and a really, really fault-free election.
Yeah, this time and in the past, the abuse he took is it the Secretary of State role to rephrase potential changes to the Constitution to make them more accurate, and he did get rebuked in the court system here on that matter. And his argument with regard to voter ID, that this was not simply requiring people to prove who they are, this was a fundamental change in the election system.
But that rebuke was hotly contested in the Supreme Court.
Oh, absolutely.
And a brilliant dissent by Paul Anderson in that regard.
Yeah, and again, depending on how this was implemented, I mean, this was such a brief bit of language that it would have dramatically, it could have dramatically changed the voting system. It really just depended on implementation. But I think that when there were so many unanswered questions with this, that it was a fair assumption that in order to do what the proposed amendment was set out to do, it very well could have meant a wholesale change in the election system. Sure.
How do you think the approach to women by the right wing affected this election,
Well,
particularly on a national level?
Yeah, I think both in the state and national level that, I think the marriage amendment drove turnout. I heard in a lot of areas voter turnout was lighter because some people were turned off by it, but then around the Twin Cities, I live in South Minneapolis, it was as busy as it's ever been. So what you really saw was maybe some people who weren't as excited about Obama in the past, but were extremely engaged on particularly the marriage amendment issue. So I think that drove turnout. It probably cost seats for the Republican Party, and then at the national level,
The attack on women.
they have a problem with message framing, and absolutely. I mean, we saw 2 Senate races that were clearly in the hands of the Republican Party that they threw away based on rhetoric around reproductive rights, and those are. So very few analysts said that they thought the Democratic Party was going to pick up 2 Senate seats, but those are the 2, So it was a catastrophe.
What about the Bible thumpers?
In terms of
How that affected people? I think a lot of people were turned off by representatives, people seeking office and people in office telling them that they were doing what Jesus told them to do, in particular
yes,
picking on Jesus, but that's what they mostly said, or it's in the Bible. Or something. I think that God really has a sense of humor, and he set these people up, and he's laughing like hell because they fell for it.
Yeah, I can't speak for the Almighty on that issue, but it definitely seems that, it is interesting to see reproductive rights, not sort of this pragmatically, but wherever we are, there are some, I think, on both sides of the issue, but we saw more of this on the Republican side, that we need to be pushing it more in our direction regardless of where we're at. And we've seen in this country, Roe v. Wade has stood, but with many more restrictions. There are many fewer abortions in this country than were once undergone. And so it's interesting to then say, well, we want to completely eliminate access to some of these areas. And then some of these other laws.
Or the attack on Planned Parenthood.
Planned Parenthood, which is a major source of health care for millions and millions of
provides
women.
health care for millions and millions of women. A very small amount of what they do affects abortions.
Well, sure, and making these arguments that say, people who take advantage of or use in vitro fertilization or these kind of things, that's tantamount to that those access to that should be removed, or birth control. The debate as to whether or not the Healthcare Reform Act should include mandates on birth control access was a loser for the Republican Party. I don't know why they went down that path. This is a pocketbook issue for most families. Many other things are covered that relate to people's sexual life with regard to their health care, and attacking this area was probably bad policy, but also terrible politics.
How about the minorities? They came out overwhelmingly for Obama on the national level, and I think they really were very supportive on the local level as well. But it seems that the Latino vote was over 70% in his favor. The black vote, African American vote, was 90+%. I think that in the question of Latinos, other than perhaps a few Cubans in Miami, that they felt that if the Republicans got in, they would get very tough on immigration and try to force a lot of them out of the country.
Well, sure. I mean, this notion of self-deportation, that we're going to try to make things as tough as possible on you so you leave on your own. But this is a sea change with regard to the Republican Party. I mean, you take a look at President Bush, both President Bushes, but particularly George W. Bush, speaking Spanish to groups of people, talking about comprehensive immigration reform. If you take a look at some of the social issues with regard to Hispanics, sometimes it seems like they might line up better with the Republican Party on so many social issues. So why are they losing by such dramatic numbers, and the reason is a catastrophic Republican primary season where they were trying to outdo each other as to who wanted to crack down hardest. Not to mention that illegal immigration is dramatically down in this country. The borders are more secure.
Since Clinton.
Well, and particularly, one, because the economy has been in decline, that there's not the demand, but the borders are being enforced more. And the argument by those who are against immigration reform in the past said, well, when we get the borders secure, we'll talk about comprehensive reform. Well, the borders are secure, at least when it comes to illegal immigration. We're still dealing with narco trafficking and all that kind of, and the violence there. But this notion that it was a big loss that didn't need to happen for the Republican Party. They didn't need to lose 4-1 in these
Well,
demographics.
it's interesting. In the 4 years since George W. Bush, or the 8 years since George W. Bush, whatever it is, he spoke Spanish, and it was very favorable. Then we had Sarah Palin. She spoke gibberish, and which is a little different than Spanish, and it certainly turned people off. And then we had, as you mentioned, this Republican primary, where they jumped all over each other to see who was going to be tougher on throwing people out of the country.
Absolutely.
And it's like shooting yourself in the foot.
Well, and you have to look at it pragmatically as well. There aren't enough Greyhound buses to take the 10 million people or so that may be here undocumented. So the question is what do you do about it pragmatically? You know, really, what do you do? And the Obama administration's line on this has been, if you get in illegal problems, we are going to be very strong on removing you from the country. But for those people who have been here decades, or those people who came here through no choice of their own, we need a process in place of legalization. And this is good because they're paying into the tax system, into the Social Security system. It creates greater stability. I've seen this in the classroom. I've had students that have come to me, sitting in my office, and they went through high school. They didn't even know they were undocumented. And then they go to college, they apply for federal student financial aid, and for the first time in their lives, they're told they don't have any options.
Well, as usual, we have touched a few topics.
Right.
So many we didn't touch that I want to talk about the effect on students and what this election is going to mean. The auto bailout, which certainly affected the election. The death of Osama bin Laden. Chris Christie and Hurricane Sandy. These are all factors that factored in, and we only have a minute left, so I guess we're going to have to leave that for another discussion, and you're certainly welcome back.
Well, I appreciate you having me.
Early and often. Any final thoughts in the less than a minute we have left?
Oh no, I just think that the comments that you made there, particularly with regard to the hurricane, showed that this is a president that can work pragmatically with folks at the state level to get things done. And when it comes to the role of federal government, people like a small federal government until they need a big federal government, and that was a clear situation there.
The difference between Katrina and Hurricane Sandy. 2 hurricanes, 2 presidents, 2 very different results. And I think that people across the nation saw that. And I do think that it turned some heads.
I think so.
We've been talking with Zack Sullivan, professor, Inver Hills Community College, my old hometown. And thank you so much. Come back soon and we'll finish our political discussion, or I'll have another one.
That sounds
Thanks,
good. Thank
Zack.
you, Alan.